Phil Lawler and Jennifer Roback Morse are up next. But first, a little news. The fight over the remains of Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen appears to be over. The Archdiocese of New York said this week it will cooperate to transfer Sheen's remains to Peoria, Illinois. This after the court shut down any further appeals by the New York Archdiocese. They have repeatedly ruled in favor of the late Archbishop's family, who requested the body be moved to Peoria. Sheen's cause for sainthood can now proceed once his body is returned to his home diocese. Bishop Daniel Janke of Peoria says he's grateful for the decision. And the Sovereign Military Order of Malta announced this week that it has banned the use of the extraordinary form of the Mass. According to the head of the order, quote, all of the liturgical ceremonies within our order must be performed according to the ordinary rite of the Church and not the extraordinary rite, the Tridentine rite. The Catholic lay group traces its origins back to medieval Jerusalem. The Grand Master cites the cohesion and communion of the order as reasons for the ban. Here now to discuss these stories and a few more, I'm joined by editor of Catholic World News and author of the book, The Smoke of Satan, Phil Lawler, who joins me in studio, and author of the book, The Sexual State, Dr. Jennifer Roback Morse, joins us from Louisiana. Thank you both for being here. Francesco Cesario, who's the chairman of the National Review Board, insisted that lay people should be part of the investigation of any bishops charged with wrongdoing. Will this metropolitan model work? Phil Lawler.
No, it can't work. And the reason it can't work is because the metropolitan model assumes that we have confidence in the metropolitan archbishops, and we don't. That's the reason we're having this crisis. Bishop Dealey, in presenting the proposal to the Bishops' Conference, cited or made the argument that the system had worked in the McCarrick and Bransfield cases.
Right.
Well, if those are successes, I'd hate to see a failure. We have people hemorrhaging out of the church, losing confidence in the hierarchy. No, Professor Cesario is right. We don't have confidence in the bishops, and we won't have confidence in their investigations.
Jennifer, the bishops, in fact, I had Bishop Proprocki, we had Bishop Barron on earlier in the show. They say, look, there is a lay component here. There's going to be a board that the first complaints are delivered to, and they may be part of investigations down the line. Is that sufficient in your mind as a researcher and somebody who spent a lot of time looking at the data here?
You know, I agree with what Phil just said. I don't see how lay people just kind of looking over the review board is going to be adequate. What I think is really necessary, Raymond, is for the laity to simply take the bull by the horns and be paying attention, adding pressure, putting their own forms of pressure and attention onto the situation. Because no matter what the policies and procedures are, if the laity are asleep at the switch, the bad guys will be able to drive a Mack truck through any kind of policies and procedures. But on the other hand, if we're paying attention, any set of policies and procedures are going to work a whole lot better. And so that's why we're devoted to trying to step up the informal, if you will, activist involvement of the laity.
Jen, I want to talk about your institute. The Ruth Institute put out a report this week that shows that the overall number of homosexual priests have declined in the church since the 1980s, and therefore the number of male victims has declined as well. However, the number of female victims is rising. Why are we seeing this shift?
Well, I think the key thing is what you just said, Raymond, that it appears that there are fewer homosexual men being ordained to the priesthood. And so what we're seeing, if you look historically at the data, what you see is this big spike in male victims, and now that those male victims have declined. But underlying that same data is a sort of steady stream of female victims. So there have always been female victims. But they're going to become relatively more important as we have fewer male victims. So that's in one of the reports, one of the table 14, I think, in our report. You can see very clearly this spike in male victims and just the kind of steady, you know, year in, year out number of female victims. But so there's not a huge amount of movement there.
How numerous are these victims, though? They're declining in the macro, right?
Yeah. Well. Well, actually, yeah, that's one of the things we're quite concerned about. I mean, there was kind of a trough, you might say, around the year 2004, 2002, right around after the Dallas Charter, that seems to be the low point in the number of victims overall. But since then, there has been a disturbing increase in the victims, and so in male and female victims, actually. And so that's why we're calling for continual vigilance. We simply cannot be patting ourselves on the back and saying this is all a historical problem, it's all been solved. That's not the case.
Phil, the bishop offenders we've been seeing, they tend to predominantly fall in one category here, though. Tell me about that, and why do you think we're seeing the predation primarily on males in a lot of these bishop offenders that we're hearing about anyway?
Well, it's very hard to avoid the conclusion that there is a network, a homosexual network that promotes within the clergy, so that you have a disproportionate number of homosexual bishops, disproportionate number of homosexual priests in chanceries, and they're taking care of each other. They're looking after each other's interests. And so they rise up the hierarchy and have more opportunity to take care of each other.
Now, Jen, you say in your report, Catholics shouldn't fool themselves that sex abuse crisis is limited to the homosexual clergy. Abuse is abuse. Are you content that the bishops have properly understood the problem, whether it's straight or homosexual in origin?
You know what? I'm not confident at all that the hierarchy appreciates the full scope of this problem, or that they're willing really to face it head on. I mean, there's the factor that Phil just mentioned, which is that some of our bishops, sadly, must be complicit. It must be that they're complicit, that they know exactly what's going on, and they don't want to talk about it because they don't want to implicate themselves or their friends. But one of the things we did find in the data is you follow the offenders through time. You know, Father Sullins had data that goes back to 1950, and we follow people through time, and what you see is that there were two kind of waves, you might say, like the ordination classes around the late 60s, early 70s. The predominant number of abusive clergy were ordained around the same time. So there's two big batches of them, late 60s, early 70s, and then another batch in the 1980s. And if you follow those guys, you see, you know, that they're accounting for at least half of the abuse year in and year out. So that has been a very striking feature of our most recent, very thorough analysis of the data, that you've got a couple pockets there where there were a lot of gay men, I guess, ordained, and as Phil just mentioned, they have aged. They are now occupying positions of authority and power, and that's what we're dealing with.
Jen and Phil, I want to call your attention to something that broke in this week. Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano was interviewed by the Washington Post. He did it via correspondence. He responded to nearly 40 questions. The Post chose not to publish selected passages. Now, I have come into possession of an unpublished section that I do want to share with you. In it, the Washington Post asks, do you see any signs that the Vatican under Pope Francis is taking proper steps to address the serious issues of abuse? If not, what's missing? And Vigano says, going back to the summit and its focus on the abuse of minors, I now wish to bring attention to two recent and truly horrifying cases involving allegations of offenses against minors during Pope Francis's tenure. The Pope and many prelates in the Curia are well aware of these allegations, but in neither case was an open and thorough investigation permitted. An objective observer cannot help but suspect that horrible deeds are being covered up. Now, that's the quote. We are not going to reveal all the details of the people he implicates, but the first case involves abuse by a seminarian towards a boy, starting at age 13, and then several fellow seminarians. This, according to Vigano, occurred at the pre-seminary in the walls of the Vatican. The seminarian is now an ordained priest. The whistleblowers were expelled from the seminary, and Vigano alleges that bishops were involved in the cover-up. The second is a case that involves a major Vatican official appointed by Pope Francis, who Vigano contends was involved in terrible immorality and sexual abuse of seminarians. Despite knowing this, his appointment proceeded. Your reaction, Phil Lawler?
Well, this is new to me, and I wish I could say I don't believe it, but I do, because I've heard so many stories along similar lines for so many years. And there's been a culture in the Vatican, not just under Pope Francis, I'm sorry to say it goes back, of covering up, of perhaps taking some disciplinary action, but not letting anyone in the public know why the action has been taken. And there's a long culture of this, and this culture extends across the Atlantic. It extends to our bishops. The bishops are not aggressive in investigating each other. They're, on the contrary, aggressive in toning down any investigation.
Jennifer, your thoughts on, and I've seen this pattern, if you will, it's almost vampiric in that you have an offender who then abuses someone and then ordains them. And then it continues on. In some of these cases, one of them that we mentioned just now, you see this pattern. Is this something you've seen in your research? What's going on here?
Well, the amount of detail that you've just revealed here is not something that you generally see in the type of research that we're able to do, because our material is statistical material. But I would just like to register the fact that I'm revolted by this, and I'm sitting here thinking about what is this man's priesthood going to be like if you were abused as a seminarian, if you were abused as a seminarian, if you were an abusive person while you were a seminary, and then you're ordained. What is that doing to somebody's priesthood? And the other thing that I want to point out is that in not our statistical analysis, but our work in interacting with victims of clergy sexual abuse and victims of childhood sexual abuse all across the board, is just how long-lasting the impact of sexual abuse can be. I hear from people who have had nightmares for years, who have PTSD symptoms, who have night terrors, all kinds of problems that do not go away unless they're addressed. And so if you look at it from the perspective of the victim, you know, not only is there no justice for the person, but there can't really be healing, because you're pushing the whole thing under the rug. And what really needs to happen is somebody needs to say, this was wrong, this shouldn't have happened, and we're here for you, not for your abuser. That's what needs to be said. And until enough people in the hierarchy are willing to say that, we're not going to get to the bottom of this. And that's where the lay people, doggone well, better be saying it, because we can't count on our clergy to get that done. Yeah, no,
it's a heartbreaker. And I have to tell you, I hate having to report these things and stay mired in this. I find it revolting. It's so counterproductive for me as a person and a journalist. And you know, I think of families at home having to listen to this. But if we don't report it here, it doesn't get said.
Right.
And it's a very frustrating, awful position, frankly, that I'm put in, and you and Jennifer and all of us. But I've got to go on here. Bishop Gustavo Zanchetta of Argentina was formally charged with abusing seminarians. He may face up to 10 years in prison in his native Argentina. Now, the Vatican claimed they knew nothing of the complaints against him until 2018. However, complaints against him began in 2015. The Pope brought him to the Vatican, even after learning of those complaints, gave him a job, a very good one, running all the Vatican properties, after the allegations were brought to his attention. Phil, your reaction to this?
It's awful in several respects. It just illustrates the depth of the corruption we're dealing with. First of all, do you believe that nobody in the Vatican knew about this back several years ago when the complaints first surfaced? Because I don't believe it. Second, he was not given just any job in the Vatican. As you point out, he was given a job at APSA, which is managing the Vatican investments, which is where the money is. And we all know that corruption and money go hand in hand. This is something we've just learned in West Virginia. So this is the interweaving of the threads of corruption that keep running through. I mean, we absolutely have to sever those threads.
Jennifer, what can be done? I mean, people want to be faithful. They love their church. They want to be a part of it. They want to contribute to it. But then you keep hearing these stories from the highest levels. What can the laity credibly do here?
Well, first of all, my position on this, I share your agony. You know, I mean, the agony that you just described, Raymond, I feel that as well, of course. And my feeling is we don't have the right to leave the church. The church and the deposit of faith was given to us when we were born, when we were little children. This was given to us, and we have a responsibility to hand the deposit of faith on to the people who come behind us. And so to me, it's a no-brainer. We can't leave the church, because if we leave the church, we're leaving it to people like you just described. You know, that's a non-starter. We can't do that. So what can laity do? One thing that we're trying to do at the Ruth Institute, of course, besides informing people and educating people and so on, is we're trying to give people the tools and the equipment that they might need to confront errant clergy, to confront their bishops, to complain, and to complain in an effective manner. It's very easy for people to wring their hands and moan and complain and all of that, or leave. You know,
Right.
Those are the easy things to do. It's more important to be thinking about what can we do that will get their attention and that will let them know that they're being watched.
Yeah.
And if they know they're being watched, maybe they'll behave better, number one. Even if they don't behave better, they'll be nervous knowing somebody's looking over their shoulder. And when people get nervous, they tend to make more mistakes. So that's the approach that we're taking. And I take that approach because it's kind of my inclination personally, but also because there are a lot of us. Doggone it, there are a lot of faithful people. And if we all get together and all focus on one diocese or one parish or one particular issue where we can have a specific effect on a particular person, that's what we need to do. And we need to do that repeatedly. I mean, we've got a situation here in Lafayette. I don't know if you're aware of this case, Raymond, but there was a case in Lafayette where a deacon's son was molested by a priest, okay? A deacon's son, think about this. This deacon served on the altar with this priest, and the guy was molesting his teenage son. So this priest confessed, he's in jail, and now his attorney is asking for reconsideration of his sentence because that sentence is just so mean, it's against the Louisiana state constitution. Well, I'll tell you what, some of us are writing letters to that judge to make it clear that the public cares about whether that man is, about how long that man is in prison, and that we're not going to sit there and just do nothing while somebody springs him loose. So you know, there's a role of the civil authorities here too.
I've got to move on here to this, and you alluded to the story a moment ago, Phil, the story of Michael Bransfield in West Virginia. Now, this is a bishop who wrote millions of dollars worth of checks to various bishops, checks to priests whom he had allegedly sexually harassed, as well as lavish spending on house renovations, alcohol. I have said we need to investigate these cases, but we have to follow the money trail, and a universal audit might be in order for every diocese in the world. Do you think there are more cases like this one, like Bransfield, out there, and might the money, as you said earlier, be intermingled with the sexual corruption?
I don't think it. I know there are cases like this out there. First, because I hear intimations of it and I hear reports, which I'm not in a position to confirm, but I'm working on it. But second, just look at the reaction to Bishop Bransfield. And I call your attention to one thing particularly. Archbishop Lawler headed the investigation. And then it came out that Archbishop Lawler himself had been on the receiving end of checks. Now, I'm an elected official in the little town where I live, and we have conflict of interest laws. And I know if I have taken gifts from someone, I cannot sit on the panel that investigates that person. It's obvious. It's a
Conflict of interest.
Entry-level understanding of conflict of interest. Well, why didn't Archbishop Lawler
Recuse himself.
Why didn't he? I have to assume because this is a common practice. There are checks being written. It's not all that unusual. Archbishop Vigano told the Post that when he was apostolic nuncio here, he started receiving large checks around Christmas time, and he said, what is going on here? This was entirely new to him, but apparently it's not new. There are checks flying around. And this is our money. And Jennifer was saying, you know, this is our church. This is our money. Bishops should not be free to do what they want with it, not for pastoral reasons, but for their own self-aggrandizement. That's really wrong.
Yeah, no, it's mind-blowing. When I read of this case, particularly, and you know, Bishop Bransfield ran the financial apparatus for the entire USCCB. We might remind people. It's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling at this late date that this is ongoing and may still be ongoing. Anyway, I want to move on.
You know what I like about this,
Go
though?
ahead, Jen.
Sorry, I was just going to say that. You know what I like about this, though, is that sexual sins make people crazy, and because a lot of people have sexual sins, and nobody really wants to get too get too close and look too closely at other people's sexual sins because maybe their sexual sins will come out. But money, people might just be willing to look at the money because everybody knows you're not supposed to steal. So.
Right. All right. The Vatican, Jen, rejected the notion that gender identity can be fluid in a document released over the weekend, and it seeks to affirm the metaphysical roots of sexual differences to help refute attempts to negate male-female duality of human nature from which the family is generated. Dr. Morse, how important is this document, and do you expect it will be taken up and taught?
Well, I think that part of this document is extremely important. It's very good that the church has reiterated that point. You wouldn't think it would be necessary to say men and women are different, but in our day and age, it is necessary to say that. And so it's very good that they said it. It would have been a disaster if they had said anything else, that's for sure. The place where I'm a little bit concerned is that they keep talking about dialogue, and I'm not sure who you're supposed to be talking to about this. I think that the basic understanding, the basic reality of male and female, it should not be up for discussion. And we can discuss a lot about how to help people who are struggling with that, or what many aspects of it can be discussed. But I think we need to be real careful about what we're going to talk about here.
I want to move on. The leader of the Knights of Malta made big news this week. He banned all celebrations of the Old Rite, the Old Latin Mass, at official liturgical celebrations within the military order. Now, it has to be done only according to the ordinary form of the Mass. What do you make of this decision? Why is this happening? Why is this important, Phil Lawler?
It's not important for him to do it. It is important that he did it because it's a sign that the powers that be in Rome are cracking down more and more on any sign of support for the old rite, of any sign of not being in lockstep with the liturgical preferences of the current Holy Father. I mean, it's clear as day that the old form, the extraordinary form, is valid, useful, has a role. So why not in the Knights of Malta? It's just a very strange ruling.
Well, some are saying it's a purge. They're trying to purge the traditionally minded members of Malta out.
Well, then they may find another generation or two that they have very few members because, you know, the thing that's not being told about the extraordinary form is it's a youth movement.
Right, right. A lot of young people at that Mass. What do you make of, and I'll ask you this and I'll go back to Phil before I run out of time. What do you make of this multi-year legal fracas in New York? The Archdiocese of New York wrestling for years in the courts with Joan Cunningham, Sheen Cunningham, who is Archbishop Fulton Sheen's niece, over his remains. Just to make a long story short, at the time when the cause was forwarded, New York would not take it up. It went to Peoria. They began the cause with the understanding that when the time was right, when the canonization was moving forward, the body would be relocated from New York to Peoria. Now, this week, it appears the court has said there are no more options here, and New York is complying with the request. Your thoughts, Jennifer, on how this is perceived and why they're wasting money on this fracas?
Well, I must say, I don't know why they're wasting money on such a fracas. It's very unseemly and unfortunate that it has come this far, but I think it's good that it's being resolved. And I think sending the remains back to Peoria is probably the best thing.
Yeah, why not just divide the remains, Phil? That was done all over the church.
Oh.
I mean, you know, you've got St. Anthony's tongue here and his head's over here. This happens. It's a way of spreading the wealth, if you will.
Well, maybe that might be the Solomonic decision to ask people, the two dioceses, if they want to split it and see who objects. But I think it is very unseemly. It's nasty. It seems to be a happy ending that the cause will now be moving forward, probably very quickly, I'm told.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. So we'll see what happens there. Finally,
I just hope more people will read his things.
Yeah, that's true. They'll read his works, and that could be a good thing. Finally, last week, Cardinal Walter Casper said, if this upcoming synod on the Amazon agreed that married men could be priests and proposed such a change to Pope Francis, he would probably, in principle, accept it. What do you think of that idea? And do you think the bishops will agree to this? Jennifer.
I can't predict what the bishops will or will not agree to, but I can tell you one thing. Our Paul Sullins here at the Ruth Institute is himself a married Catholic priest because he was once Episcopalian. He's also a sociologist and has written a book on married Catholic priests, so he knows more about the subject than anyone. And he would tell you flat out that a married clergy is no panacea for the sexual abuse crisis. And whatever other implications there may be, it will not solve the sex abuse crisis.
Phil, I hear there's also going to be openings here about a possible reinterpretation of what communion can mean, and perhaps an expansion in the understanding and reception of communion, as well as this question of ordaining married men.
That's more troubling to me. There are married Catholic priests. That can be done. I don't think it's a good idea, but it has been done. It is done in the Eastern churches.
Right.
But reinterpreting communion, now you're getting to the very core of our faith. And that troubles me. It troubles me particularly because in recent synods, nothing much has happened that didn't have the prior approval of the Holy Father. So if it's rumored to be happening, the rumor is probably being circulated out of the Apostolic Palace.
Phil, Jennifer, thank you both for being here. The Smoke of Satan by Philip Lawler and The Sexual State by Dr. Jennifer Roback Morse are available at bookstores everywhere and online. Thanks for being here.